For decades, speculation swirled around the turbulent marriage of King Charles and Princess Diana. But nothing could prepare the world for the discovery of a handwritten letter buried in a private vault where Charles finally reveals the truth behind it all. This wasn't a message to the public. It was a confession he never intended anyone to see. Until now. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The letter, sealed in a thick ivory envelope, marked only with the phrase, "To whom it may concern if the truth must be known," was uncovered among King Charles's private belongings following a recent reorganization of the Windsor archives. What began as a routine review of historic materials quickly spiraled into one of the most explosive revelations in modern royal history. The letter, dated just weeks before Diana's death in 1997, is written entirely in Charles's own hand. It is not a speech, nor a defense. It is a raw and unsettling confession, overflowing with regret, reflection, and remorse. For the first time, Charles speaks without the barrier of royal protocol or scripted interviews. He writes not as the heir to the throne, but as a man cornered by decades of silence and consequence. In these pages, Charles exposes truths long buried about his feelings for Diana, about the pressures he faced, and about the moments he wishes he could rewrite. It is a letter of anguish more than apology, an emotional reckoning far removed from the polished statements the world has grown accustomed to. The existence of the letter sent shockwaves through the palace. According to multiple insiders, royal aides initially attempted to suppress the document entirely, fearing the backlash it could ignite. But the contents were too profound and too damning to remain hidden. The truth was out. This marks the first time Charles has addressed his marriage to Diana in such unfiltered terms, and the impact of his words has shaken the royal family to its core. In a single letter, decades of tightly controlled narratives begin to unravel, and what emerges is a man tormented not just by public perception, but by private decisions that forever altered the course of royal history. But to truly understand the weight of this letter, we must revisit the cracks that formed long before Diana became the people's princess. Before the fairy tale wedding came the cold negotiations. Behind palace doors, a loveless arrangement was being brokered not for passion, but for image. Charles never chose Diana with his heart, and this section of the letter makes that heartbreakingly clear. In words never meant for public eyes, Charles confesses what many had only dared to speculate. "I was never allowed to choose love, only legacy." The line is buried halfway through a paragraph of restrained prose, but its impact is seismic. In that single sentence, the illusion of romantic destiny collapses. According to Charles, the union with Diana was never about connection, it was an orchestrated alliance, coordinated with chilling precision by the senior figures of the monarchy. The Queen Mother's influence loomed especially large, and Prince Philip's pressure was, in Charles's own words, incessant and immovable. The letter reveals a royal apparatus desperate to present stability, a future king groomed not for emotional truth, but ceremonial perfection. Diana, still barely out of adolescence, became the chosen symbol of purity and tradition. But Charles, already emotionally entangled elsewhere, was forced to play along in a production he couldn't control. He makes only veiled references to Camilla, writing of "a connection I was told to forsake," but the pain between the lines is unmistakable. Diana, he admits, walked into a world I knew would consume her, and I did nothing to stop it. He reflects on early signs of her discomfort, her anxious demeanor, her nervous glances, the way she seemed to shrink in the presence of royal formality. Palace staff, too, had concerns. Some voiced it in hushed tones, others documented it. But the machine moved forward. Appearances had to be maintained. The engagement was announced. The public swooned. The wedding date was set. Charles's account of the wedding itself is chilling in its emotional detachment. He writes of the pageantry, the endless rehearsals, and the heavy silence in the carriage ride to the cathedral. Then comes the most haunting line of all. It felt like a coronation of a lie. The image is as brutal as it is revealing, a man stepping into a union not out of devotion, but obligation. And Diana, unaware of just how hollow the vows truly were, stood beside him with dreams that would never survive the crown's reality. This section of the letter doesn't read as an attack, it reads as a confession weighed down by years of guilt. It reveals not only the emotional vacuum Charles lived in, but the cruelty of an institution that chose optics over authenticity, a monarchy that demanded sacrifice and gave nothing back. And while Charles buried his heart, Diana became a ticking time bomb of emotions seeking affection from a man trained to withhold it. While the world adored her, Diana suffered in silence. But Charles's letter reveals he wasn't oblivious. He watched her unravel and did nothing. She was a storm. "I was too afraid to meet," he writes. And that fear came at a devastating cost. In this agonizing section of the letter, Charles admits to the most haunting truth of all. Not that he misunderstood Diana, but that he understood her too well and chose to retreat. He describes the early years of their marriage as a maze of appearances, public hand-holding, and carefully curated smiles. While behind palace walls, Diana's cries for connection went unanswered. He calls her eyes haunting and confesses they carried a question he could never bring himself to answer. Her pain was visible, her anguish unmistakable. But Charles admits he chose protocol over confrontation, silence over compassion. "We were in the same palace," he writes, "but oceans apart." He places much of the blame not on himself, but on the traditions that shaped him, a royal conditioning that taught him emotional stillness, not empathy. He recalls moments when Diana's struggles were dismissed as dramatics by palace staff, when doctors were summoned more for discretion than healing. He acknowledges Diana's eating disorder with deep regret, calling it a scream that we all ignored. He writes of watching her shrink both emotionally and physically, of feeling powerless to offer comfort not because he lacked the will, but because he had never learned how. It's a brutal admission of emotional cowardice. Charles also reveals that Diana tried to leave the marriage years before it publicly dissolved. He references letters she had drafted but never sent, conversations held behind closed doors that were quickly buried under royal obligations. He recalls a moment when she stood before him, holding a packed suitcase, whispering, "I can't breathe here." He let her go to another room, not another life. It is a decision that clearly haunts him. He doesn't frame her as unstable or ungrateful. Instead, he paints a picture of a woman suffocating in an institution that never made space for fragility. And yet, through all of it, Charles admits he remained still paralyzed by the weight of expectation and a fear of emotional exposure that had been drilled into him since childhood. His inaction wasn't accidental. It was generational. He chose the comfort of control over the chaos of compassion. Diana, meanwhile, grew louder, more desperate, more explosive. But her cries fell on ears trained not to hear. His letter doesn't excuse his distance, it lays it bare. But emotional distance soon turned to war fueled by jealousy, media manipulation, and betrayal on both sides. The leaked tapes, the confessions, the interviews that rocked the monarchy. Charles breaks his silence in the letter about the moment Diana's voice became the world's headline and how it forced him to confront the truth he had hidden for years. In one of the most searing sections of his private letter, Charles recounts how the fragile balance of palace discretion and personal denial shattered the moment Diana sat down with Martin Bashir. The Panorama interview wasn't just shocking, it was, in his words, a declaration of war. The palace had long relied on silence to survive scandal, but Diana's voice changed everything. When she admitted to feeling isolated, when she uttered those now immortal words, "There were 3 of us in this marriage." It wasn't just the marriage that was exposed. It was the monarchy's inability to handle truth. Charles admits that in that moment, he realized he had lost more than his wife. He had lost control over the narrative that had kept the royal family insulated from public consequence. He writes with raw acknowledgement that the firm had no plan. "We were blindsided, unprepared, and for the first time, afraid," he says. But even amid his resentment, Charles doesn't blame Diana for speaking. Instead, he blames himself. He calls his years of emotional avoidance an affair with denial, a clever phrase masking a much deeper wound. He allowed her to be alone, knowing full well she was struggling. He watched as others painted her as erratic, unstable, emotional, and did nothing to defend her. Because admitting the truth would have meant confronting his own role in her unraveling. What Charles couldn't have predicted, he says, was the world's overwhelming response to Diana's pain. While palace officials scrambled to suppress the damage, the public crowned her something no royal title could replicate: a human being. The people didn't just believe her. They loved her for saying what the palace never would. And Charles, for all his upbringing and composure, found himself on the wrong side of sympathy. He writes that he resented the media for glorifying her struggles, but even more, he envied her courage. She told her truth before I had the courage to face mine. That line, buried toward the end of the passage, speaks volumes about the deep personal reckoning the letter reveals. The tapes, the headlines, the chaos it all became, background noise to one thing: Diana had outpaced the monarchy's control. She turned her vulnerability into power, and for Charles, it left him standing in the ruins of a system that had long promised protection but delivered only distance. But even as their marriage collapsed in public view, a private exchange behind palace walls hinted at a final act of honesty, one that would never reach the cameras. Long after the cameras were turned off and the world assumed the war was permanent, Diana and Charles shared one final private meeting. What he reveals in the letter about that moment is not just shocking, it's deeply human. It happened in the quiet shadow of an escalating storm, weeks before Diana's untimely death, when headlines were still ablaze and the monarchy was reeling from the public fallout. But behind palace doors, something unexpected unfolded. Charles recounts a late-night meeting between the two of them, far removed from cameras, advisors, or publicists. It was not scheduled. It was not formal. It was simply human. For the first time, stripped of royal obligation and media pressure, they spoke honestly. It was the first time we spoke as two broken people, not symbols, Charles writes. And in that stillness, the war between them seemed, for a fleeting moment, to dissolve. He remembers Diana's words not with bitterness, but reverence. She allegedly looked at him with tired eyes and said, "We were never meant to be enemies." That single sentence, simple and sincere, cut deeper than any headline. It pierced through the decades of silence, hurt, and resentment. In his letter, Charles confesses that he had gone into that conversation prepared to defend himself, but was met with something he didn't expect: understanding. Diana didn't accuse or attack. She didn't rehash the past. Instead, they talked about William and Harry, about the strain of fame, and about how, somehow, both of them had been casualties of a system they never fully understood. Charles writes that he wanted to say sorry, but didn't know how. And that failure, his inability to articulate regret in the moment, remains one of the most painful memories etched into the letter's pages. What makes this encounter so haunting is not the revelation that they spoke, but how much was left unsaid. They shared a cup of tea, a quiet laugh, and even a brief moment of eye contact that Charles says reminded him of who Diana was before everything changed. That night, he writes, "I saw the girl I once hoped to know. There was no reconciliation, no grand forgiveness, but there was peace, a brief pause in the chaos, a window into what might have been, had they both been freer, younger, or braver. That moment now lingers like a ghost, not just in Charles's memory, but in the narrative that history was never allowed to capture. The world saw their battles. What it never saw was their humanity. And in his private letter, that humanity spills across the page, flawed, tender, incomplete, a glimpse of resolution that never got its chance to bloom. But that flicker of peace was short-lived. Tragedy arrived swiftly, leaving behind more than sorrow. It left behind a letter, unfinished and unmailed. When news of Diana's death broke, Charles was the first to receive the call and the last to fully process it. His letter describes a scene no cameras caught, no biography captured, a man broken but forbidden from grieving publicly. It was just after midnight when the call came. Charles writes that he didn't fully hear the words, only that the room seemed to close in around him. He describes the moment as a blackout of the soul, where time fractured and meaning collapsed. In his letter, He confesses that the first thing he did was walk the corridor alone, away from the aides, away from the noise. He wept, not with theatrics or fury, but with the quiet agony of a man who had failed the one person he could never repair things with. He leaned against the cold stone wall of a palace hallway, crying in a place designed to suppress emotion. He writes that he stayed there for nearly an hour, not moving, not speaking, just feeling the weight of the finality settle over him like a shroud. But grief, in royalty, is never private for long. Within hours, officials arrived. Statements were drafted. Arrangements were made. And in the middle of it all, Charles was given a single instruction that still rings in his mind: compose yourself for the country. He writes that something inside him froze at those words. It was not the time for tears, not the time for sorrow. It was the time for performance. He was expected to be strong, measured, and distant. He had lost the mother of his children, the woman he once called wife, and was told to wear silence like armor. Then comes the line that cuts the deepest. I lost a woman I never loved properly and mourned what I never gave. It's a brutal admission, not just of failure, but of the years wasted behind pride and distance. Charles doesn't rewrite history here. He doesn't claim affection where there was none. Instead, he grieves the love he never offered, the apology he never delivered, and the family that was forever altered by his silence. He writes that he considered never remarrying, not out of tradition, but guilt. He felt that to build a new future would be a betrayal of the one he never cared for the right way, that every happy moment that followed would be haunted by the shadow of what he didn't do when it mattered most. But the image that haunts him above all, etched in the letter with devastating clarity, is that of William and Harry walking behind their mother's coffin. The crown's greatest shame, he calls it. Two boys robbed of their innocence, made to endure grief under the world's gaze while he stood behind them, frozen by obligation. He remembers Harry looking up once, his eyes red but dry. That look, Charles writes, is something he still dreams about. Years passed, wounds festered. But in his letter, Charles speaks of one mission that drove him setting the record straight, even if only in ink. In his private writings, Charles confesses he could never compete with Diana's myth. This was not just a personal loss, it was a crisis of legacy. As the years passed and grief gave way to remembrance, Charles found himself living in the shadow of a woman the world refused to forget. Diana's story didn't fade, it intensified. With every documentary, every anniversary, every new generation discovering her charisma, she transformed from tragic figure to cultural sainthood. And in his letter, Charles admits the uncomfortable truth. At first, he resented it, not because she didn't deserve it, but because he knew he would never receive the same grace. While he carried the title of future king, she had been crowned by the people's hearts. That distinction would define the rest of his public life. But over time, that envy gave way to surrender. Charles began to realize that Diana's legacy was not something to challenge, but something he could never separate from. He writes about the quiet gestures he made, away from the press, to honor her memory. A private donation in her name, a single candle lit at a chapel she once loved. Gestures no camera caught. He didn't want to compete. He wanted, perhaps too late, to acknowledge. But even those moments sparked tension within the palace. He reveals, for the first time, that aides cautioned him not to mention Diana too often, worried it would dilute the authority of the monarchy. One advisor reportedly said, "We can't canonize her and run the crown at the same time." But Charles pushed back gently, but insistently, because he knew that ignoring her only deepened the void she left behind. His greatest fear, though, was not public opinion. It was how her sons would one day interpret the story. He writes of sleepless nights, wondering how William and Harry would see him when they were older, not as their father, but as the man who stood opposite their mother in the eyes of history. He feared their silence more than any tabloid. He feared what they'd come to believe once they read the books, watched the footage, and pieced it together without him. Legacy isn't what we build, he writes. It's what we leave behind, in the eyes of our children. A line heavy with dread, because he knew that his part in their mother's pain would forever color their understanding of him. Then, in one of the most haunting confessions of the entire letter, Charles reflects on the moment he ascended to the throne. Amidst the ceremony, the ancient rituals, the chants and proclamations, one thought consumed him. She became immortal the moment I became king. It was not said with bitterness, but with awe and a quiet understanding that no crown, no matter how sacred, could erase the presence of the woman whose absence had defined so much. And yet, in the final paragraphs of the letter, Charles does something no royal had done before he lets the crown fall, even for a moment, and speaks simply as a man. The final words of Charles's letter leave no room for ambiguity. For the first time, he admits what millions suspected. Not just that he failed Diana, but that he never tried hard enough to save what was lost. Charles begins his last passage, not with pomp or metaphor, but with a single, searing truth. I should have fought for her. I should have fought for us. The sentence lands like thunder, not because it is elaborate, but because it is bare. After decades of deflection, narrative control, and carefully worded press releases, this moment, this confession, is startling in its simplicity. He does not blame the press, the palace, or protocol. He blames himself, the man, the husband, the one who stayed quiet while she cried for help in plain sight. He writes of the silence that stretched between them, the walls that grew taller the longer they refused to look one another in the eye, and the indifference he wore like armor because it was easier than vulnerability. There is no defense in his tone, only regret. He confesses that he never truly learned how to love her, not in the way she needed, not in the way she deserved. He admits that, for too long, he believed duty could substitute intimacy, that appearances could outshine authenticity. And by the time he recognized the cost of that blindness, the damage had already been done. She asked for warmth. I gave her structure. She asked for truth. I gave her silence, he writes. Each line a wound opening wider, exposing the sorrow beneath the crown. But the most haunting part of this section isn't what he says in daylight, it's what he reveals about the darkness. Charles confesses that even years after Diana's death, her voice would visit him in dreams. Not with blame, not with anger, but with sorrow. She asked me, in my sleep, why I waited so long to speak, he writes. These aren't dreams of escape, they're hauntings. Memories demanding resolution he can never fully give. Ghosts of what might have been if only he had chosen differently. It is not history, he says, it is confession. This letter, he declares, was never meant for the archives. It was meant for her, a message sent into the silence of the world, unsure if it would ever be heard. And then, the final line quiet, aching, irreversible. If she ever reads this from wherever she is, I'm sorry. A sentence not designed for headlines, but for healing. Not designed to defend legacy, but to lay it down. Because in that single sentence, Charles does not speak as a monarch, a prince, or even a husband. He speaks as a man who once had love in his hands and let it slip through his fingers. And now, years later, he has nothing left but ink, sorrow, and the desperate hope that it's not too late for forgiveness. But the release of this letter didn't just reopen wounds, it forced the firm into full damage control mode, as the public demanded answers no press secretary was prepared to give. As news of the letter's contents spread across global headlines, the palace scrambled to contain the fallout. But how do you rewrite a narrative that had already been written in grief, betrayal, and silence? In less than 24 hours, what began as a private confession transformed into a constitutional reckoning. The palace, silent for decades on the emotional wreckage left behind by Charles and Diana's marriage, was now forced into an impossible corner. Acknowledgement. Denial was no longer an option. The letter's tone, its intimacy, its unmistakable voice, there was no question it came from the king himself. A carefully worded statement was issued, confirming the letter's authenticity, but reframing it as a deeply personal expression not intended for public discourse. But the damage was done. Royal insiders whispered of chaos inside the walls of Buckingham. Senior aides, many of whom had built careers around protecting the narrative of royal unity, were reportedly blindsided. Meetings were called. timelines dissected, questions raised about who leaked it and why now. Sources suggest the king himself was not the one who ordered the letter's suppression nor its release. And yet, there it was, laid bare for the world to see. A raw, unvarnished account of regret, silence, and love unspoken. Behind closed doors, the debate turned vicious. Some advisors argued that the vulnerability would humanize the king, especially to a generation who never forgave him for Diana's pain. Others feared it cracked the very foundation of his reign. A monarch confessing not just to failure, but to emotional paralysis in the face of tragedy. One aide reportedly described it as too much truth, too late. But public reaction told a different story. Around the world, people lit candles outside Kensington Palace. They reread Diana's own interviews, replayed her voice, but now with new context. Tears came from those who had lived through the scandal, and those just now learning the real depth of what was buried beneath the tiaras and protocol. Social media erupted with emotional tributes, not only to Diana, but surprisingly, to Charles as well. "It takes courage," one post read, "to admit you broke the thing you once held most sacred." William, Prince of Wales, was said to be deeply moved. He reportedly spent hours reading the letter alone, then shared it quietly with Catherine. No official comment was made from the prince's office, but insiders noted a shift, a softening, perhaps even the beginning of something healing, however fragile. Still, not everyone welcomed the reckoning. Parliament murmured about the monarchy's stability. Tabloids split into factions, some hailing Charles as finally stepping into his truth, others calling for silence in the name of legacy. Because now, the world has seen what the monarchy hid for decades, not just a doomed marriage, but a confession that came too late. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.